Hi, welcome to my next Substack Live. Today we're going to be speaking with Olivia Juliana. This is really great. I one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you, and this week we're actually talking to a bunch of different activists and people who are involved in this movement, but they do very different things than I do, is because, I sit in my studio and I do my show. Sometimes you bring me something, I'll get emails from Olivia at times when I try to be sleeping saying, here's an issue that's important. Here's a candidate that's important. So, one of the reasons I wanted to have you on is I want to hear about what are activists doing today, day to day? Because my day to day is what's on the show today? Who am I interviewing, right? You are in this space where you're involved in all sorts of different things. So I'm really looking forward to this. Thanks for doing it.
Yeah, of course. I'm always happy to talk about what activists are doing. Thankfully, it really just depends on what shenanigans are being pulled at any given time in any given location. Since Trump has taken office, this week, I'm gonna probably be at the Texas Capitol. There's a public committee hearing about the redistricting they're trying to do in Texas, so I'll be there. We'll see if they actually let people testify. The Texas legislature is notorious for giving odd hours and putting limitations on it to keep public comment minimal. So that's what this week looks like for me. Is just making sure that people have the resources they need to get registered so that they know they have the right to give public comment. Other weeks, it looks like going to protests at the University of Houston because professors have to go back to the country of origin because their visas were revoked or they were denied. That's what it looks like here in Texas, but it's just constantly trying to keep track of the ever-changing amount of information that's out there about what is going on here in America.
Let's get back to that. For people who are my followers and maybe they don't know you, you have a very interesting origin story. And one of the really interesting things was when we saw each other at the White House in the towards the end of the during the last year of the Biden administration, I got a chance to meet your dad. And what was so interesting about that, and he was a super nice guy, was as I recall, I don't know that you deprogrammed him, right? I'm like that. There's big language here that I'm applying to this, but it's a very interesting story of political differences in families, in a sense.
Yeah, I grew up in a very conservative Christian household. I grew up Southern Baptist. I went to the kind of churches where, they put hands on you and people spoke in tongues. And that was very much the environment that I grew up in. And my dad has been conservative for my entire life. I went to school in the morning, talk radio was on. When I was going to bed, Fox was playing on the TV. And I like to say my dad didn't shape my political opinions, but he did shape my political mind. He went to school for political science. He didn't get to finish because he had a football injury and my mom started having kids, but he was always very much invested in it. And so it was very important to him that we were invested in it, that we, read the Constitution and that we knew what our rights were and that we voted in every election we could. And it was just very important to him. And so I grew up believing that I was Republican because that's what I had been taught. And it wasn't until I got into high school, I joined debate and I started researching for myself. I realized there were so many things I didn't agree with, I didn't believe in. And my dad, up until this past year, he was a Republican. He voted for Donald Trump in 2020, and he supported Ted Cruz. Like this is a very odd story of my dad loves me, but he's not always been very supportive of what I do. And when we met was I took my dad to the Hispanic Heritage celebration that was happening at the White House because, we're Mexican American. And I actually think that day was kind of a big moment for him because he was around all of these Democrats who he had like heard all of these things about on the news for so long. And then he was like, wow, these people are nice and normal, and they're not insane. And, last year my dad voted for Kamala Harris and Colin Allred. So Progress definitely made. But I started making content on social media because we were in rural Texas and I didn't know any Democrats. So I thought I could maybe find them online. And, 5 years later, here we are.
So talk me through so you start making content. What's his initial reaction? And I'm guessing because, most people who start making content, it doesn't really go anywhere. As you start building a following, what does he say? Is he worried about his conservative friends seeing what you're doing? Is he worried about you're advocating for the wrong stuff, Olivia? What was that like?
He never told me what I could or couldn't believe. It's actually a running joke in my family. My dad always said something along the lines of you can bring home a Republican, you can bring home a liberal, but don't ever bring home a vegetarian. I think it's that's a Texas thing. Is he had friends that were Democrats and Republicans, and so for him, it really was a matter of, am I being safe? Am I happy? And I think the biggest obstacle really was my extended family. They are not the most supportive of what I do. A lot of people who, I grew up in the church with are not the most supportive. And that was a little bit of the contention point at first was, what are people going to think? Especially because at the time I was living in such a small town. It was the kind of town where, my dad had graduated from high school there. My grandfather had graduated from high school there. So everyone knew who I was. And everyone was like, oh, Paul's daughter, that crazy liberal. Um, but as time goes on, as time went on, I think he saw just how much passion for it I really had. And he became a lot more supportive. So where he would start going to events with me and he would start, watching interviews I did. And I think actually one of the biggest moments in our relationship was uh, I was invited to speak at the Texas Capitol in 2021, and I didn't have a way of getting there. I asked my dad to take me, and it was an abortion rights event, and my dad said no because he's pro-life. Thankfully, I found a way to get there, but years later, my dad just out of nowhere, he told me, he was like, that is one of my greatest regrets as a father is that I didn't go with you. I should have been there for you. And I say he's cautiously pro-choice now. I think he, like many people, thinks that what's happened has just gone way too far. And having me as a daughter certainly helps uh, kind of break through there. But it's been a journey over the last few years for sure.
Last thing on this, and then we'll get back to activism. Was there a specific issue that made him say in 24, okay, I'm not voting for Trump again, I'm voting for Kamala Harris?
January 6th was a really big thing for him. He felt like the thing for him is he was like, Trump's a sore loser. And he just kind of kept going on about he just can't accept defeat. Like this guy's a loser. And an abortion. My sisters started having kids, and I have a sister who was pregnant in Texas when the abortion ban started getting really dangerous and really risky, and that was something that he took really seriously and understood the weight of what was going on.
All right. So, with that as kind of context,
Hmm.
one of the things that I hear a lot now from people who they don't like what's going on, but they do want to get involved is okay, voting. Got it. I'm going to vote when there's an election. Fine. I could become a content creator, but I don't really want to do that. I don't want to be on camera or whatever. Um, what are the sorts of things that I can do? Listen, with the big, beautiful bill, I was very honest with my audience. It's sort of like, listen, Republicans are going to pass this thing. And you're going to get your 4 Republican senators who will sort of pay lip service to, I'm concerned, I don't know. But then they'll just offer goodies until they get to 50. And then it's going to come JD Vance and he'll break the tie. So it's not that calling your lawmakers doesn't matter, but Republicans have determined they're going to pass this damn bill. And
Yeah.
ultimately it happens. So there's sort of a question as to what sorts of things can young activists do right now to have the biggest impact?
Yeah, I think that we got to look back at 2017, 2018. What were the things that were effective in the first Trump administration that really helped? And something that is wildly effective, and it's so simple, is being involved and looking at what's going on in your local government. It matters so much more than people think it does, because the way I get people to understand this is by saying, Trump can give the orders from the White House, but ultimately it's the sheriffs and the county commissioners and the city council members who are deciding how money is getting spent, who is deciding what the ordinances are where you live. Like, these are the people that are going to be enforcing these rules and regulations, and they're not expecting people to pay attention. And that's why, you saw an influx in down ballot victories in 2018 after the first Trump election, is because people kind of started to realize and correlate some of those things. And we've really seen, like someone in the comments is saying, people paying attention to school board races. These are extremely important in determining the future of this country because of the curriculum in schools. So the thing that I always tell people, the most important thing you can do is become active, engaged in your local government, and also show up and make them know that people are actually paying attention here. I live in one of the biggest cities in the country. I live in Houston, Texas. And in 2023, only 17% of eligible voters in our city voted in our mayoral election.
Wow.
In our city council elections. And now we have 3 Republican at-large city council members in the biggest, bluest city in the state. And so if people just pay attention to that and get involved there, we can start to make a really big difference from the bottom up.
So there's obviously voting in mayoral, or depending on what the structure of your city government is, sometimes it's, a select board, mayoral and city councilors. Okay. School board seems like another aspect to this. What else is there locally?
A lot of places have civic clubs that they'll have political events that you can do, like block walks, door knocks, protests. They'll keep you plugged into that, but they also will do mutual aid at the same time. So, like for me here in Houston, I'm a member of the Houston LGBTQ plus caucus. That is a club that is dedicated to helping and supporting the LGBTQ plus community here in this city. I'm also a member of the Harris County Young Democrats. So I know at any given time, if there's something going on in the city or there's an event going on, I can go and find out where I need to get plugged in. And almost every major city, pretty much every major city has these. Every county, for the most part, will have a county Democratic Party that typically coordinates with a lot of these nonprofits that are doing on the ground mutual aid where you live. And so if you really don't know where to start, that's kind of the best place where you can get involved, is find your local city or county Democratic Party. Or find a nonprofit in your area that's doing something that you care about. Maybe you don't care about politics, and maybe that's really overwhelming to you, but you care about the fact that children are going hungry. Go volunteer at the food bank. Go help organize a food drive. Like, these are actual, real, tangible things that can make a huge impact on people's day-to-day lives.
What do you think more generally about, with the successive generations in elections up until 2024? Usually, as you go down to younger and younger age groups, they vote more and more Democratic, on average, across elections over periods of time. We saw for the first time in 2024 that the youngest voters made a move in the direction of the right, in the direction of the Republican Party. This is on average nationally, of course. What do you think is the reason for that? Is it, I'll give some options, but these aren't all of them. There's the possibility that it's ideological, right? That younger voters are identifying more with the policies of the Republican Party over the Democratic Party. There's the possibility that it's about sort of the activism that's happening online, the manosphere, Charlie Kirk on campuses, this sort of thing. There's the possibility that it's economic, right? Which is younger voters are saying, I'm graduating college, costs more than ever, debt, jobs aren't paying. I don't know. I think maybe it's time for me to give the Republicans a shot or something like that. What do you think explains it?
I think it's a combination of all of those things. But before I give my answer, I'll say I think we have to look at the frame of reference that young voters have. So I'm 22. This past presidential election was the first presidential election I was eligible to vote in.
Yep.
And a lot of people don't understand about Gen Z. The Republican Party And the Democratic Party that we've been raised with is very different than the traditional two parties that most generations have been raised with. So, for example, um, I was born after 9/11 happened. So I grew up in a post-war on terror America. That's the reality for many people in my generation. And Barack Obama was elected president when I was in kindergarten. So by the time I was old enough to really start paying attention to elections, the Republican that was leading the Republican Party was Donald Trump. He is the person who, for the majority of our lives, has been the person controlling the narrative of what politics looks like. And so a lot of these young people, when they hear things like this isn't normal or this is extreme or this is radical, it doesn't resonate because this is the only political circumstance that we know.
Hmm.
And especially for young men, uh, you know, to them, Donald Trump is this cultural icon. This is a guy who we grew up watching on TV. He was on WWE at The Apprentice. This guy who we watched, tackle Vince McMahon. You can't be that scary. I mean, he's a reality TV star. And he represents all of these things that young men are conditioned by society, largely by the Republican Party to be. He's wealthy, he has a beautiful wife, he has successful businesses, he embodies all these things that they're told they have to embody as well. But it's impossible for them to do that in America because of the policies the Republicans are pushing for. And if you're a young guy, and I know many young guys like this. It's not rigidness in ideology. Period. It's not. Most of them are pro-choice. A lot of them agree with the substance of why the Black Lives Matter movement existed. They're just working their asses off, working jobs, going to school, taking out loans. They're doing all these things, and yet they still can't get to the place Republicans tell them they should be. You should be able to buy a house. You should be able to provide. Why can't you? You're a failure. You're not a man. And if they're working that hard, are they going to blame themselves for that, or are they going to find someone else to blame? And I think that that's where Donald Trump made the most gains, is convincing these young men, or these young men in particular, it was the fault of the Democrats, it was the fault of immigrants, it was the fault of women who are pushing you down. And I think that that's why we saw not just young people move to the right, but why we saw young men in particular move to the right.
It's so interesting what you say because, of course, you're correct about the image that Donald Trump wants to portray himself as, and you're right that the people around him do the same thing. A little examination also shows that it's a pretty inaccurate image, right? I mean, when you look at by their own standards, not by our standards, but by their own standards, um, the makeup and the hair and the ill-fitting clothes, and he's kind of a slob, and he doesn't exercise, and he portrays himself as the biggest victim and has to go running to either courts or election boards or the media anytime someone says something mean about him. I mean, it's quite snowflakey, even by their own standards, but it doesn't really matter because they built the idea around him that
Hmm.
he is the alpha. And you could even apply this to people like Stephen Miller or J.D. Vance, or there's this perception is reality thing where there's a lot of smoke and mirrors here, but it works. It's convinced people.
Yeah, and who better to do the smoke and mirrors than a reality TV star?
Right. Right. What do you think? So I agree with you that this move for Gen Z towards the Republican Party this year, it doesn't seem based in policy. It's like, it's not trade policy that's attracting Gen Z to Donald Trump, or at least it doesn't seem to be. As you say, in some areas, it's actually at odds with, for example, the generically pro-choice views of Gen Z. What do you think it would take to bring that group back to the left? And, Bernie's explanation is there needs to be a credible path to believing that the Democratic Party is actually going to solve the issues of you graduate with insane debt, you can't afford a house, and you can't get a job that allows you to even get an average apartment in most cities. Like, is it that kitchen table stuff you think that might bring that group back?
I think that that's certainly part of it. I think another part of it is feeling represented and seen within the party. And I've talked about this before. I think that the Democratic Party, in the name of being as inclusive as possible, has made ourselves very exclusionary.
Mm,
And I think an example of this is, I've gone to so many political rallies, I've done so many roundtables. You'll see a politician change the message of what they're saying based off of who they're talking to. Well, like, I'm going to be in a room of young women today, so I'm gonna speak like I'm talking to young women, or I'm going to be in a place today with Black voters, so I'm going to talk like I'm talking to Black voters. And the way that we've gone about doing that, I think, has put people into these boxes, and it's separated us in a way that the Republican Party just hasn't. Donald Trump, he might change what his message is depending on his mood, but he doesn't change what his message is depending on his audience. It's
mm.
almost always the same, but we are constantly changing our messaging. And I think when you do that, white men in particular, that's not something where they can go and they can find a place. Or young men in particular, I think, especially with the rise of social media at the same time, they feel like they've been made out to be part of the problem or the enemy of the party. And I think that the solution of this is, I don't even think we necessarily need to change what our policy is. I think our policy is right. I think the way that we talk about it is the problem. I think we have a very strong bench of strong leaders who are men within the Democratic Party who should just go out there and talk about what it means to be a man in America. We have, Wes Moore. He's a veteran. We have J.B. Pritzker, who is a billionaire who could talk about business. We've got Gavin Newsom. We got people like Ruben Gallego, who's a father. Like, these are people who know what it's like to be a man in America. They should be able to go out and talk about it without being told, well, why are we centering men in the conversation? We're not centering men in the conversation. We're having a conversation about men. That's the difference.
What
And
I
I
think
think
is
that,
super interesting about that is I've recently seen former President Obama, and I've also seen Scott Galloway. I don't know how familiar you are with Scott
yeah,
Galloway. Both of them have been really talking about this issue of, hey, we can't just do like the toxic masculinity stuff. We need good visions of masculinity where, like, while the right might say bullying people is alpha, putting people down is alpha, this sort of stuff, actually raising people up is what's alpha.
yeah.
Having the confidence to say, hey, you know what? If the bullying is actually a sign of a self-esteem problem, not that you're cool, it's actually a sign that you are really insecure, and we should ostracize the bullying and go, no, 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 saying you're not going to bully my friends. That's actually like the alpha thing to
Hmm.
do. And so it's very interesting that in the last 6 to 12 months, both former President Obama and Scott Galloway have been starting to talk about that in ways that seem to me like much healthier versions of how the left should talk about masculinity.
I agree. And you pulled my string here. I'm like, I sprung up because, like, I've written so many articles about this. Which, it's ironic almost that the bisexual Latina from Texas is the one who's talking about how we should care more about young men. But I talked about this, and I was like, when you look at the framing of how Democrats talk to men so often, we are perpetuating the stereotypes of what men are supposed to be in America. And I'll give you an example. When we talk about abortion and how men relate to it, we say, well, real men are protectors of women, and they'll do anything they can to protect the women in their lives. My counter to that is, well, men are affected by abortion bans too. And it's not just because of the women in their lives that they care about. It's because if you're a young man and you haven't planned for a family, and your partner has an unplanned pregnancy, you are now about to become a father. Do you have the financial means to do that? Do you have the ability to provide for this child? Are you going to get married? Like, these are very real realities that young men have to face. And we don't message about that. We don't message about helping them have the opportunity to be a father or to prevent that from happening in the first place. And I think that these are real missed opportunities and miscalculations that the Democratic Party has made pretty consistently that I think that we could change. And I think once we do, we will start to see a lot of young men come back into the fold.
I think that's very, very interesting and insightful. Let me talk a few minutes in the time we have left about something that kind of directly affects us as creators, as writers, content producers. We look around and we see the successful lawsuit against George Stephanopoulos. We see the success, thanks to Paramount's decision to settle the 60 Minutes lawsuit because they wanted to avoid a protracted legal battle. It's not what 60 Minutes would have done. It's not even what CBS would have done, but Paramount made that decision. We are seeing Trump talk about denaturalize Rosie O'Donnell. He's bragging on Truth Social about how he's responsible for Stephen Colbert getting canceled. Okay. Individually, these are all business decision, legal situations, etc. The problem is it's encroaching closer and closer and closer on the independent progressive space. And one of the things I've been telling my audience is one of the things that potentially puts us in a better position, you, people like Aaron Parnas, who we've had on, the Midas guys, everybody in our ecosystem, is when we are, number one, directly supported by our audiences, and number two, own our data so that if a platform cancels us, we can still reach our followers. We protect, I don't want to say uncancelable, but it is a significant protection against some of the things that are happening when 30 layers of executives and producers are saying, this is too much of a risk, you're fired, the show is canceled, etc. And so we're doing this on Substack right now. This is just the truth. I say this on YouTube too, where it's not the truth. On YouTube, if I get canceled on YouTube, if YouTube shuts me down, I have no way to reach my 3.3 million subscribers. I don't own the data. I don't have any of that. And so one of the things I think is so important about the independent progressive space on Substack specifically is that people can directly support our work and we own our lists. We can download our list. And then if anything happens on Substack, which hopefully never will, but you never know, we are able to reach our audiences. And so I think it's really important that people like you and Aaron and Midas, and we're all building on a platform. No platform is perfect. You never know when someone will pressure a platform. I've been doing it long enough that it can happen, but there are some really important things going on right now on Substack. And it's why I think it's such a great platform for people doing what we do.
I agree. I couldn't agree more. My goal is to have Substack to be my full-time job at one point. God willing, we'll get there. But I mean, it's true. That's a constant worry. Is today going to be the day where they file a lawsuit against a creator, or they file a lawsuit against an activist who's just saying things that they don't like?
Right.
But that's the risk that we take to tell the truth in modern day America, I suppose.
And, lots of us, I was talking with a lawyer recently about this. We are careful to say, as reported by, right? We're commenting on it, but we're not reporting because we believe that to a degree, this protects us. And I think it's true that it does to a degree, but at the same time, that if and when they decide they want to try to make an example of one of us, it's not going to matter if you said as reported by, right? I mean, because the lawsuit will be the punishment, even if it's worthless.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I don't want to say go after me. I'm not afraid to tell the truth, but I think that you'll see probably there are creators like us who are more willing to fight these things than the mainstream news actually is. So I mean, maybe that's what it'll take is one of us actually just doing the basic courageous thing of saying, I'm not going to apologize for telling the truth, that a lot of these companies just aren't willing to do. God knows why, but here we are.
That's where we are. We're doing the best we can with the situation we find ourselves in the middle of 2025. Olivia Juliana is who I've been speaking with. If you're one of my followers, make sure you're subscribed to her Substack. If I'm new here and you know Olivia, I would be flattered if you subscribe to mine. Let's do this again. Olivia, keep up the great work, and it's always so good to talk to you. And say hi to your dad for me.
I will. This was so much fun. Bye, y'all.
Take care. Bye.